In the name of the Father and the Son, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, the glory forever and ever. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Okay. Have a seat, Habibi. Can we come just here, closer to us here? ها؟ عشان presentation وعشان yeah. Hi, Habibi, how are you? Okay, we're gonna start now, and I would like first of all to welcome Basim Gohar, PhD psychology, and Sandy Samson, board certified behavior analyst. Thank you for coming and giving us a good time to spend with us. Thank you very much. I appreciate. And the topic of today about understanding ASD, which means Autism Spectrum Disorder. So we would like to thank them, and we will do streaming. So anybody who want to just review, you can find it on YouTube of the church. If you have any question, I think at the end we can ask just to get more information, if you'd like. I chose this topic because we found that we started having at our church few kids with autism. And that's why I chose this topic, and we asked Basim and Sandy, and they are willing to talk about this because they are specialists about that, and we can get benefit from them as we can, because we are planning to start specific service for those kids. So we pray that God will help us to do this service soon after we listen to this lecture. So we're going to start, or whatever you want.
Do it here. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. So, as Abuna, first of all, thanks for having me here, and Sandy as well. We really appreciate it. It's always nice to come back to Brampton, so I think most of you know that I used to come here years and years ago. But here's a funny story. Before coming here, I used to go to the Kitchener Church back in the 1990s. And that's where Sandy goes. And we didn't know each other. She was a little bit younger, but I was good friends with her little brother. And then we just found out that she's in the field in mental health. So it's kind of interesting that the worlds are colliding and that we have connections after all, small world. So today's talk, we're going to split it into two ways. The first part is I'm going to talk about the diagnostics piece. And when you talk about diagnostics, you're going to learn about what are the symptoms of autism, how common is it, okay? And then from there, Sandy is as a board certified behavioral analyst. And by the way, this title, which might seem new to some of you, this title is now going to be a part of the College of Psychologists of Ontario. So as a psychologist, I'm regulated by the College of Psychologists. The college is actually going to change its name to the College of Psychologists and Behavior Analysts, and Sandy is going to be a part of the college as well. So congrats to Sandy and all other BCBAs. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the diagnostics piece first, and then the part that most of you probably want to learn more about is Sandy's part, which is the behavioral component to it. What are some of the things to expect and how to work with these children and these adolescents? Okay? And hopefully there will be enough time that we can have open discussions and answer whatever questions that you have. Just as a first thing, I know that sometimes when we are servants, we really care about what we do. And we start looking at kids and youth and we say, oh, they must be on the spectrum, or they must have this, they must have that, okay? Please try to avoid doing that. And maybe even some of the things that I'm gonna say, be like, oh, could this be me? That's also possible, that people do that. But again, don't worry too much about what the diagnosis is. If you are genuinely concerned about a child, or is it your child, you can go and get professional consultations. But the goal of our discussion is not necessarily to say, oh, this person is autistic or not autistic. The goal is to learn how to deal with the behavior, okay? Because this is the important piece, because that could work with multiple populations, not just children with autism. In fact, it could also work with children, and could also work with your husband or your wife. You'll see. So autism spectrum disorder, I'm going to refer to it as ASD from here. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder, okay? So it has to be from childhood. And it includes two main features. The first feature is impairments in communication and social skills. And the other piece of that is either restrictive and or repetitive behaviors. I'm going to talk in more detail about that in a minute. So if we had 100 kids in front of us right now, odds are 2 of them will likely have a diagnosis of autism or meet the criteria. It's more common in boys, so it's 4 times more likely to be common in boys. Typically, we start seeing these symptoms from 2 or maybe a little bit older. It's sometimes tricky because some kids are nonverbal, so we don't know if it's autism or something else. But it starts to be very, very obvious around the age of 4. And typically the assessment process starts around the late age of 4, maybe the beginning of 5. But from the ages of 5 to 10, that's where most of Canadians, at least, are getting the diagnosis. And as I mentioned, it's more common in boys. So one thing that I hear all the time, Kida, suddenly there's like a huge surge of autism diagnosis. I know so many people with autism. Is it something in the water? Is it the vaccines? Is it this? Is it that? What's going on? Have you guys noticed that too? There's more autism diagnosis now than it was before? Yeah. I don't blame you for thinking that way, but I have a few reasons why that is. First of all, there's less stigma now about mental health. So me growing up, or people who are older than me, them growing up, talking about mental health was just something you don't want to talk about. So people who had an autism diagnosis were typically excluded from things. They wouldn't go to activities, they wouldn't go to events. The parents were very, very much hovering around them. Okay? And there's more awareness about it now too. We're openly talking about it. So that's one reason. Another reason is actually the changes in the diagnosis itself. So when I was still doing my master's, they changed the book that I was learning from. So I had to learn the old book and the new book. Which is a good thing, actually. Back then, there used to be something called Asperger's disorder. Have you guys ever heard of Asperger's syndrome? So Asperger's was not a autism diagnosis. It was very close to it, and there's also something called a pervasive disorder. But now they took all these diagnoses away, and they said we're going to call it autism, and it's on a spectrum. So spectrum meaning that the range of severity can be very low to very high. So that's one of the main reasons. So if you actually kind of start to look back, from 2014 and onward is where you'll notice saying, okay, I'm starting to hear this word autism more and more. That's one of the reasons. We're also having kids later in life. So there's a small association, it's not a strong one, but there is an association to say that the parental age can play a factor in this. Males and females, not just females. So we know with something like Down syndrome, for example, it's more common that someone would have Down syndrome if the mother is much older, but there's actually some research to show it's not a strong association. So for those who are having kids older, like don't stress about that, right? But there is a small linkage between the age and the likelihood of autism. Remember, it's not a causation, it's just a correlation. And then there's also something that we talk about, which is a differential diagnosis. So what that means is, because of more awareness is happening, okay, now there's more likelihood that people will diagnose it. And actually sometimes, currently, people diagnose it wrong. So there is a part of that, okay? Historically, it wasn't diagnosed as much, again, because there's Asperger's syndrome and pervasive disorders and things like that. But now you're talking about something that is becoming more overdiagnosed. And there's many reasons why. There's a lot of disorders that have similar features. And that's why we recommend, if somebody needs to go for an autism diagnosis, to go to a specialist that will actually do a full assessment. You can technically go to a family doctor and they can give the diagnosis, right? But you want someone to do a full investigation to gain a better understanding, because there are sometimes very similar diagnoses that are overlapping. And I had this instance myself. So I was doing an assessment for it was actually an adolescent, and ADHD to the max. The reason why I know this is because he was on my ADHD medication. So I met with him one day with his medication and another day without his medication. And it was like two different kids that I was working with. But kids with ADHD, as an example, and I'm going to talk about that, they have similar features. And they can be a little bit awkward. So that psychiatrist who diagnosed that child with autism, it was not accurate. But there were reasons to explain that a little bit more. So that's why it's important for us to be more thorough with the assessments. And then, as I said, fun fact, there's really no strong evidence or any evidence really to show a linkage between vaccination and autism. What happens is, you gotta remember of the age of the child getting vaccinated. It's around the time where you actually start noticing there's a difference, or there's some factors that are affecting that child. So they're not speaking, they're not socializing. It's usually around the same time that they would go for a vaccination. But those two are actually not strongly correlated. So how do we diagnose someone with autism? So I'm gonna tell you the core things. First and foremost, with any psychiatric disorder, the disorder needs to actually have a significant impairment in their lives. So whether it being at school, socially, at home, there needs to be an impairment. We use a lot of clinical terms in our day-to-day for no good reason. So let's say you have a test next week or tomorrow. We don't say, I'm worried about the test. We say, I have anxiety. That's not true. You don't have anxiety. You might, but we use a lot of clinical terms inappropriately. So I'm worried about a test. Oh, I'm so depressed over this. No, you're not depressed. You don't have depression. You might be sad, which is a symptom of depression, but that doesn't mean that you actually have depression. Or that you like to have things, for example, lined up nicely, and you don't like to have cupboards that are open. You're not OCD because you like that. Maybe, but you're not. But we use all these terms, or, oh, I just had an ADHD moment. We use clinical terms every day. But the main thing here to remember, for any disorder psychiatrically, it needs to have significant impact in your ability to function daily. Okay? And as I mentioned, you need to have the social communication part and the restrictive and repetitive behaviors. I'm going to talk more about those now. So persistent deficits in social communications and interactions. So what does that look like? So typically those children have a hard time having like a back and forth conversation. So you talk to them, you might actually call their names, they don't listen to you. You ask them like, how are you? They might not respond at all. Or they might say good and walk away. There's no interest in like a give and take relationship. They don't say, you know what, I want to play with this kid, so maybe I will, let's say it's a kid that likes cars and another kid that likes, I don't know, dolls. So the kid that likes cars and wants to play with this other kid, they might say, okay, you know what, let's play with the dolls and cars together. A child with autism wouldn't do that. They're gonna do what they like only. And in fact, most of the time they prefer to play alone. When they're really young, they do something called parallel play. So as you know, like parallel, okay? So if there's a bunch of kids playing, someone with an autism or someone who's autistic would be doing something similar but from a distance, not actually engaging with those kids, okay? So the main thing here is there's not a lot of back and forth. And also, they struggle with the non-verbal communication. So as you know, communication is not just verbal. Most of it is actually non-verbal. So when you smile at them, they may not actually grasp that. They don't make good, and just so you guys know, all the things that I'm saying, it's not like all of it has to apply. It's like symptoms, right? But you need to have a sufficient amount of symptoms in certain areas. Some kids with autism also struggle with eye contact. You'll notice that they're not necessarily looking at you, they're kind of just gazing. So that's one aspect. They don't understand facial expressions. So if I'm genuinely upset, they may not actually understand that. And they're also concrete thinkers. So if you tell them, and this is like an exaggerated example, but if I say, hey, what's up? They might actually do this. And they struggle to understand sarcasm, okay? So if you're very sarcastic, you should probably tone that down with someone with autism because they might actually take you literally, okay? The main thing here is that they struggle with abstract. So if I tell them what's the difference between, or how is a pen and a pencil alike, they can tell you, okay, they both write. But if you say, in what way is the difference between demand and request, it's much more abstract. They will really struggle with that, okay? So they like things that are very concrete, very, very tangible. And they also have a hard time making friends. So a big part of that is actually they don't want friends. And when they get older and they do want friends, they don't know how to develop that relationship. They don't have that social awareness piece to it. And that is obviously the part that parents usually struggle with because they want their kids to be social and their kid typically doesn't want to or doesn't know how or both. So as I mentioned, you need to have significant impairments. The second piece is it has to happen at a developmental period. I think I forgot to mention that. Occurring from early development. So we can't say someone who's like 18 years old suddenly developing symptoms. It doesn't work like that. These things need to be present from childhood to be diagnosable for autism. Sometimes things get missed, but that's why you need to have really good history taking to be able to make a diagnosis for someone who's older. But for the most part, you need to have good, sound evidence from a young age that there's actually these deficits. The next part is the restricted and/or repetitive behaviors and interests. So some children who are on the spectrum typically may develop sort of repetitive, sort of routinized behaviors. So you might see them doing a lot of self-soothing, like rocking back and forth. When they get excited, they start flapping their hands, or they do things with their face. There's different things that they do. But probably the flapping of the hands is the most common sort of like hand or body gestures that they do, especially when they're excited. They might also be very, very picky on how things look. So if you're sitting at the kitchen table with them, they need to maybe have the food lined up in a certain way. And if it's not lined up that way, they will have a really hard time with that. Even with colors. Even if you go in their room, they might be very meticulous about the order that they have. They might also engage in something called echolalia, or echolalic speech. And this is when they basically repeat things. So you might say something, they'll like maybe repeat a word of it. Or if they watch a movie, they sometimes usually have like a movie that they love, and they watch it over and over and over. In fact, sometimes they don't even watch the full movie, they watch one scene and they rewind it over and over and over. And sometimes you'll see them just saying these words with no context. Now, for all the parents in here who are having like a bit of like an anxiety, or I shouldn't say anxiety, but worry because I said that, it's also typical for young children to do this behavior because they're rehearsing things in their minds. But for kids on the spectrum, it's very, very excessive, and it's not like a 1 day or a 2 day or a week thing. It's like every day for weeks and months and years. Okay? They're very ritualistic, as I said, and they're very rigid. So they insist on things being exactly the same. So let's say, for example, that their routine is they go to school, they come back from school, you take them to the park, then you take them home. Pretend that day it's raining, they're gonna have a really hard time because it's the routine that I must go to the park after school. And they struggle with transitioning. So from going one activity to another, if it's not a part of their routine, you will see this behavior. And as I mentioned, they have very highly fixated interests. So the stereotypical ones, for example, is like trains. A lot of boys, for example, on the spectrum are like so obsessed with trains. And it's not just saying, I like trains. They know every fact about trains and the types of trains and where they are and how to, when they were built. Like they become almost experts and historians about a specific thing. And even when they play with a train, they may not actually play with it in a proper way that you think, and I'll talk about that in a second. But anyways, the interest is just too extreme. We see it with anime as well, and Pokemon and all these things, like they just become, like even when you tell them, okay, please stop talking about that for now, they'll pause for a second and then they'll just start over again. And if you talk to them about something else, they will completely ignore you and they'll just keep talking more and more about that topic. Some of them also experience sensory issues. So a lot of kids will say, like they would hate, for example, the tag in the back of their shirt, or their socks if it's a little bit wet, or they have really strong sense of like smell or taste or even temperature. So sometimes if you're giving like a child a bath and you touch it, even with the elbow thing, and it feels warm to you, it might feel really hot or really cold to them. So their sensory is very, very different. We see it with textures as well with food. Some of them will absolutely refuse to eat anything like that's really like chewy or really mushy, for example. So these are some of the things that we see. Again, bear in mind that some of these are also common things with children without a diagnosis of autism, okay? But I'm just kind of showing you the picture. So as we said, we have marked impairment. It has to happen from early development. You need to have the communication and social piece there. You need to also have the stereotypy and or the restricted and fixated behaviors. So as I mentioned, that autism now is a spectrum, okay? So it all depends on the level of support that they need. So we have 3 different severity levels. The first one is the minimal one, or the mildest one. This is what we call now as high-functioning autism, commonly known as Asperger's. Those children, for the most part, if they received some supports with how to communicate and how to socialize from a young age, they can grow up and become quite successful. When I was in university, there was actually a boy on or a man on the spectrum. I didn't know until they said it. And then when I found out, I was like, okay, I can see it a little bit, but they can get married, they can function, they can do many, many things. And you know, as long as they had some support at some point. So they do require support, but not intensive support. Now, level 2 is where it's tricky, because how do you define level 2? Basically, you have to make sure that it's not level 1 or level 3. And that's how we say that this is level 2. Okay? So they require some support. Typically, their communication is not as strong. They might say simple sentences and things like that, but they're a lot more rigid. But again, they require some support. And of course, they're requiring very substantial support, you would know, because they basically have a hard time functioning. So they're almost exclusively nonverbal. There's also something called adaptive skills. So their ability to do their day-to-day things like bathe, shower, go to the bathroom, things like that. They might be very, very intelligent, but they actually don't have that skill. So those are the people that I would say will require very substantial support. Okay? See now how you can get the level 2 is basically you have to rule out it's not level 1 or level 3. There are other specifications. So it could accompany a language impairment, and it could also accompany an intellectual impairment. It doesn't have to, but it may, okay? So we do know that many who are on the spectrum also have an intellectual disability, or they have a language impairment. So who can diagnose autism in Ontario? A family doctor can, technically, but you'll notice now that they would actually say, you know what, let me take you to a pediatrician, or let me take you to a developmental psychiatrist. Because there's a lot more testing that needs to get done. There was a period where it was just like a note from a doctor. That's probably contributing to this high surge of the diagnosis. But typically you want either a pediatrician, psychiatrist, or a psychologist. And the reason is they don't just do a small interview with you and the child, they do a lot more testing to rule other things out. So how do I diagnose autism? Number one, I need to get lots of information. This is not just a 1-hour meeting. It's sometimes a 2 or 3 hour meeting, and I go back and forth because I get information, I observe the child, I go and talk with people in the school, and I do all kinds of things just to make sure that I have a pretty good understanding of the child and also understand the child's development. Because some of them come to me when they're 9. Actually, there's one that I'm doing right now, he's 14. And the school thinks that he's psychotic, or he's having, that he has schizophrenia. But that child actually has an intellectual disability, so he doesn't really understand what he's saying, plus he also has autism. So you can see how complex it can get sometimes, okay? So you need to get as much information about the child from a young age. So when they start telling us things like, you know what, they didn't talk till they were like 4. They would use our hands to point instead of them using their hands to point. They would struggle with routines, like if the change of routines. They wouldn't eat specific things. They don't make eye contact. They don't have friends. All these things, all right, now we're starting to see a picture. We also do something called psychometric questionnaires. So it's not just a questionnaire that I make up. It's a questionnaire that's basically done with statistics involved. So it puts kids basically on a normal curve, and then we can see based on that statistically what are the odds of them potentially having a diagnosis based on specific symptoms. We don't necessarily just rely on that. You shouldn't, and you can't, because we're human beings, and we're not just a questionnaire. And it's also important to do clinical interviewing with the child. So we do something called the ADOS. I don't know if you guys have heard of it before, but that's a test where I'm actually interacting with the child in a naturalistic environment. And I say that because it's never really naturalistic. But I get them to play with something, and I say, all right, pretend that this is X, Y, and Z. Can you do that for me? Show me how you can, show me your routine using your hands, like to, you know, for going to school in the morning, just to see what they do. And then we also do a full psychological assessment, typically, to see if there is an intellectual disability, to see if there's ADHD, to see if there's language issues. Because again, sometimes the behaviors can be very similar, but it's a different diagnosis altogether. So when it comes to concurrent disorders, so concurrent disorders means that two or more disorders kind of happening at the same time. So it's about 31% that I found of children with autism will also have a diagnosis of intellectual disability. Some studies found it as low as 18% only of people with autism, and some found it as high as 38%. And I want to mention that intellectual abilities is not just an IQ score. So people say, oh, my IQ is 130 or 120 or 115. So Miriam works with me, so she does all the psychological testing, and she can tell you about that. Intelligence is not based on one ability. It's based on various abilities. So your verbal and your nonverbal, your perceptual, all these things. So me, for example, my verbal intelligence is higher. I'm not saying it's like high average, I don't think it is, but it's higher. But my visual spatial, so my ability to read a map and sort of be coordinated, I am probably the lowest there possibly is. Like, I don't know how I would survive without a GPS. So when I lived in Orangeville, which I'm sure some of you know how small Orangeville is, I still use the GPS. So anyway, children on the spectrum, I'm not generalizing, but typically their visual intelligence is very high. Some of their intelligence like above average, almost like superior level. They just understand visual things very, very well. But someone can look at them and not think that they have this ability. Why? Because most of the things that we do is verbal. It requires lots of instructions. Even if it's a visual task, it requires a lot of verbal instructions. So children on the spectrum typically, not always, but they typically struggle with the verbal intelligence piece. So their ability to reason verbally is really, really hard. Okay? As high as 80% of those on the spectrum could also have a diagnosis of ADHD. Could be as low as 20 and as high as 80. And what does that tell you when you see this high variability? That there's probably not accuracy in the diagnosis. But this is to say that ADHD, so attentive deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is very common or has very much overlapping symptoms with autism. And some of them also have kind of OCD-like behaviors. This is the part that I think it's really important for us to notice, is that there are lots of diagnoses, as I mentioned, that can mirror autism. So sometimes kids on the spectrum will hyper-focus on something and they cannot get their minds to do anything else. You know who else does that? ADHD, believe it or not. So people think that people with ADHD can't pay attention on things. No, sometimes they can't pay attention what's going on around them because they're focusing on the one thing. And that one thing is typically a very stimulating thing, like a video game. You'll never see a kid with ADHD hyper-focusing on like math because it's not very stimulating. But a video game or sports where there's lots of external stimulation, kids with ADHD will actually hyper-focus on that. Some of them actually might be so bad that they might actually pee themselves while they're playing a video game because there's no awareness. And that's ADHD, not autism. So that's very similar, but autism could also have that. Issues with eye contact? Yeah, a lot of kids with ADHD have that too because they're not paying attention. They're not concentrating. And when you have a conversation right now with someone with ADHD, you are so boring compared to a screen, okay? It's true. That's why even if someone doesn't have ADHD, I strongly urge you to try to limit the screen time with kids. Because even if it's not an ADHD piece, even if it's not a diagnostics piece, what they're learning is they need to get stimulated from something externally rather than their brain trying to create the stimulation. Does that make sense? So I used to do psychological assessments in northern areas where they had a lot of Mennonite families. And Mennonites typically don't do any technology. And I remember the mom was holding this child and the child was just like staring at me because I was making faces. I've never seen that in any other child. There's a chance that maybe because I'm brown, they've never seen a brown guy before, that's a possibility. But it's also because they're stimulated with their environment rather than a screen. Again, I'm not saying that your kid being on a screen is going to be doomed. I'm not saying that at all. But it does affect, to some degree, their level of attention on other things, because nothing is going to be as exciting as a screen. Okay? And it also affects your social skills a little bit, because we're now talking to people while we're on our phone. Yeah, I hear you, Mom. Yeah. Yes, I have to go clean your room. I know, right? So that's very common as well. So we need to help our kids to kind of get off the screens a little bit. Sensory issues. Kids on the spectrum can have sensory issues, but so are other diagnoses, including ADHD, and even a non-verbal learning disability. So non-verbal learning disability are kids that have strong verbal abilities, but their visual is really weak. And what happens is they have a hard time reading the person in front of them, so they make assumptions, so they act impulsively. And that's very similar to ADHD, but it's also similar to autism. Anyway, so the whole point behind all of this is don't worry too much about what child has what diagnosis, unless it's your child and you want to get an actual an actual assessment, that's fine. But what you want to focus on is the behavior. And I think this is probably a nice segue to bring Sandy on board so she can talk to us about the behavioral piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Bassem. All right. I just want to give a disclaimer that I really love public speaking, so I'm so happy to be here. Thank you guys for having me. Yeah, sarcasm. Sorry. I should give a disclaimer as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about behavior, but just to give you guys an idea, I started working in the field probably in 2010 or 2011. So I was working with kids with autism up until about almost 2 years ago, and then the last year or so I was working with adults with brain injuries. So behavior is behavior across the board. It doesn't matter if it's autism, it doesn't matter, as Bassem said, you can use it with your neurotypical kids and or spouse, which I do. And you will see and hear about some of that. Okay, so we're gonna go over behavior basics. Please ask questions. I don't really know what's relevant to you guys, so if you have specific situations that you guys want to talk about, we can work through that together. I just want you guys to get a basic understanding of behaviors and how we analyze them, and then how we move forward and work with them. So behavior is any activity of any living organism. So it's how we interact with our environment. As a behavior analyst, I like to look at behaviors that I can measure, but I can't measure everything. I can't measure people's thoughts, I can't measure people's feelings, but those are behaviors. One thing you can ask yourself, it's called the dead man's test. If a dead man can do it, then it's not behavior. So, for example, getting wet is not a behavior, right? If there is a dead man there, you can spray water on him, that's not a behavior that he got wet. Now, if the individual was blocking the water, or if they tripped and fell, a dead man can't do that. So that would be considered a behavior. I'm not going to go into the whole assessment piece of things, but we do, when we're observing a target behavior that we want to work on, either skill building or if we have maladaptive behaviors that we're trying to reduce, we do want to do an assessment on it. So that helps us gain a clear description. When I'm working with a family that's saying, oh, you know, my child keeps having tantrums, well, I would like to know what a tantrum looks like. I have 2 kids, some of you may have seen them running around. Noah's tantrums are way different than Naomi's tantrums, and their triggers are very different. But doing these assessments helps me understand what their triggers are, what the precursor behaviors are, what can I look for, what can I change in my behaviors so that I can change their behaviors. So sometimes there's events, times, situations that I can learn about that will help me predict those behaviors. It also, again, in a treatment center setting, when I'm looking at specific behaviors, I want to be able to measure if my interventions or my strategies are actually working. So there is a lot of data collection, it's very specific. We're looking at very specific things just so we can see the effectiveness and the efficiency of the interventions. Otherwise, if it's not working, then we have to modify the intervention so that we can see some success. So this is a very, very basic way that we analyze behaviors. So if a child came in and a parent was saying to me, you know, they're always triggered by X, Y, and Z. I want to see that for myself. So I'm going to look at the ABCs. A stands for antecedent, B stands for behavior, and C stands for consequence. So I'm going to go into a little more detail on that. The antecedent of the behavior is the trigger. So what happened right before the behavior happened? This can be anything in the environment. It could be how the child interacts with the environment. And I'm using the term child, assuming that you guys are working with children, but it can be any individual. So the antecedent can be an event, a person, an object, something that happened that caused the behavior to happen. Then we have the behavior. So that's verbal or physical. What did it look like? What does it include? So if you were a therapist that was working under me, I would tell you, I want to know the topography of the behavior, which is what does the behavior look like? I don't want you to tell me aggression, because like I said, Noah is very different than Naomi. His aggression is like, I'm going to throw something at my sister, and Naomi's aggression is, I'm going to hit my brother, right? So it has to be very specific and very well defined. So some examples are hitting, yelling, self-injury, which again, not specific enough. Are they biting themselves? Are they hitting their heads? What is it that what is the behavior that they're engaging in that we are looking to modify? And then there's the consequence. So this is what happens immediately after the behavior. This is probably one of the most important things to capture, because if you have a recurring behavior, it's usually the consequence that's maintaining that behavior, right? So the consequence can make it more likely for it to occur again, or it can make it less likely for it to occur again. So just to give you guys an example, we can go through the ABCs. You tell your child it's time to clean up their toys and go to the dinner table. The child starts screaming, throwing his toys around the room. You wait your child out. When he's ready, he comes to the dinner table 25 minutes later. So the antecedent in this scenario is that you've told your child they have to clean up their toys, right? That was the trigger. The behavior is that the child starts screaming, throwing their toys around the room. How did the parent react? They waited 25 minutes, and then the child didn't have to pick up their toys. They got to go to the dinner table when they were ready and eat their dinner, right? So with that, I'm going to talk about the functions of behavior, because every behavior is communicating something. There are 4 functions of behavior that we look at. So sensory, escape, attention, and tangible. So Bassem mentioned a couple sensory things. So sometimes you might see the rocking back and forth. That's a calming strategy. Maybe that feels good. You might see an individual covering their ears. Maybe it's too loud. Maybe something feels good, right? Like that's why they're engaging in that behavior. In the previous example I gave, where the parent told the child that they had to pick up their toys and come to the dinner table, that was escape, right? The child didn't end up having to clean up the toys. They engaged in that behavior because they didn't want to follow through with the demand that their parent gave them. The other thing is attention. So again, I'm going to use my kids as an example. When I am with Naomi and I'm working with Naomi, I start seeing Noah engage in some negative behaviors because he wants mommy to look at him, right? So negative attention, still attention, right? It's still strongly reinforcing. In a Sunday school setting, that can be very difficult because if you have a class clown and the peers are laughing, they're the ones that are reinforcing that behavior, right? They're strengthening that class clown behavior. And then the last one is access to tangibles or activities that they might want. So we have a small water park locally and we have a season's pass. When I tell the kids that we're not going, holy moly, do they have a meltdown, right? They want access to that water park. Or if I tell them they can't have screen time, big meltdown, right? Sometimes kids with autism or any individual that's nonverbal, they might engage in aggression, right? So I've worked with kids who can't tell me, I want that iPad. So they'll hit me and try and grab it, right? Their behavior is communicating that they want something. Just a quick tip, you can remember the functions of behavior with the acronym SEAT. So sensory, escape, attention, and tangible. Okay, I have an example of escape very similar to the scenario that I gave. This is my daughter, Naomi. Just to give you guys an idea, my husband and I slept in the other day. You don't know her. My husband and I slept in the other day. Noah and Naomi decided they're gonna bring down every pillow that they own, every stuffed animal, their reading chairs, everything, put it on the main floor, and we're gonna have a movie night at 9 o'clock in the morning. Not happening in my household. So I come out of my room and I'm like, what is happening? You guys need to clean up before we get started on our day. So they start cleaning up, and Noah's like, Mom, can I tell you something? Like, it's really hard to go up and down the stairs. And I'm like, well, you did it to get everything down, so you're gonna do it to get everything up. So Noah's good about it, and then I have Naomi. Oh, you guys can't hear it. So I say to Naomi, you have to go clean up the rest. Naomi's reaction is, no, I don't want to. So the trigger is that I gave a demand, you have to go clean up your mess that you made, otherwise we're not doing anything. And her behavior is that she's flopping on the floor, she's whining, she's telling me I don't want to. So there's a non-compliance piece there. The consequence, which is not pictured, is that I said, okay, well, we're not doing anything until we clean up. So I had to maintain that demand. And just to throw something out there, kids are so smart, which is so annoying, but they come in contact with a contingency one time and they learn it. So if I let her get away, she's gonna be like, oh, next time I just have to flop and whine and I'm not gonna have to do it. I can give you another example that was super annoying. It was early on in my career. I worked with an individual who did a lot of toe walking. So they walk on their tippy toes. And that's concerning because when they walk flat foot, then their muscle has to stretch and it becomes painful. So the parents got AFOs or leg braces. The kid hated them. We were working up to 8 hours a day, starting off with 1 hour. He had one accident. He wet his pants and he learned, oh, you have to take the AFOs off and clean them when I'm wet. Bro, did his accidents go through the roof or what? He learned it the one time he made that connection, right? So kids learn that. We're gonna talk about reinforcement a little bit later. I'll wait on that, okay. So the other thing to consider is setting events. So this is not necessarily the trigger to the behavior. So it's not the same as the antecedent, but this is a variable that might make the behavior more likely to occur. So I'll give you my own personal one. If you talk to me before I have a coffee in the morning, I'm gonna be more likely to be set off. Don't talk to me before my coffee. If kids are tired, if they're sick, if they're hungry. I'm sure many of you have heard the term hangry. I'm so hangry right now, don't talk to me until we eat, right? These are all things that might make the behavior more likely to occur. So Naomi's not usually set off very easily, but when she doesn't eat, or when she doesn't sleep well, or she's tired, she's missed her nap, when I ask her, that's the behavior I see, is the no and the flopping. So Bassem mentioned changes in routines. So I threw in here going from your regular school year into your summer holidays. That's a huge change. That can set off anyone. And then there's environmental factors, which ties into the sensory thing, it's too hot, too cold, too loud, too crowded. So that's the basics of understanding the behavior. So now that we have the what, let's talk about the why, and let's brainstorm how we can manage behaviors. So if you're managing sensory behaviors, depending on what it is, it may not be socially acceptable. So sometimes we try and give another alternative that might give that same sensory output. So I work with a lot of other professionals because behavior analysts don't have the answers to everything. So one example I can give you, we had a child who used to, when he was very excited, would spit in his hands and would rub it. Whatever reason, he'd be watching an iPad video and he would be so excited, spit in his hands and rub it. That's really gross. So we tried to change that by giving him like Theraputty or Silly Putty for him to be rolling in his hands. Same sensory output, but it's more socially acceptable than spitting in your hands. We also want to redirect inappropriate behaviors. So try and engage the child in something else. And then we want to reward the absence of behaviors. So if there's certain behaviors that are always happening, when the child is not doing it, we want to recognize that, right? It's good. It's a good feeling to be recognized when you're doing something good. And then, like I mentioned, we want to teach a more socially acceptable behavior. And if there's an appropriate time or place to do it, we can also teach that. So with my most recent job, I was overlooking group homes. And one of the issues was one client likes to rip up papers, just everywhere, all around the house. Didn't matter if it was a flyer, didn't matter if it was like important papers that we needed, our data sheets. So we tried to teach her that you can do that, but only during craft time or only when you're sitting at that table with those papers, right? You don't just find a paper and start shredding it. That's not okay. So you can try and teach times when the behavior is okay. Then we want to manage escape-motivated behaviors. This is huge. One thing that we teach a lot is communication, functional communication. So Naomi, for example, this morning I put on pink socks, God forbid. She wanted the blue socks. We had a huge meltdown. So I'm like, okay, ask me again nicely. And she said, Mommy, can you put my blue socks on instead of my pink socks? Sure. I want to strengthen that behavior. So when there's an escape behavior, we want the kids to be able to ask for a break. This is too hard. I need a break. I don't want them to swipe everything off the table. I don't want them to run out the door, right? You can ask me and I can honor it. I want to strengthen those good behaviors. We want to reinforce and praise as much as we can when they do follow through. So when Naomi went and cleaned up all those pillows, I threw a party. I was like, amazing, good job. Thank you for listening. I feel so happy. Like, how do you think Daddy feels? Daddy feels so happy, right? We want to really, really, really celebrate the times when they do follow through. Sometimes, too, they might need a little bit of extra help. So I might prompt Naomi through, right? I say, you threw that on the floor, pick it up. She says, no. I go hand over hand, I'm like, this is picking it up. Done. I still reinforce that, good job picking it up. I might not throw as big of a party because I obviously had to do some of that work. It wasn't completely independent, but I still want to reinforce that. The other thing I want to mention, so going back to setting events. So like I said, I know that when my kid doesn't have a nap, it's not going to be a good day. So I might change my behaviors in order to change her behaviors. So instead of telling her, go get all the pillows, I might say, you know what, go get your stuffies and Mommy will get the pillows, right? Even that little bit of compliance, I want to reinforce that. So I might change my behaviors knowing those setting events. Managing attention-seeking behaviors. So planned ignoring is a big one. I don't give attention when my kids are misbehaving. It's not that I'm ignoring them completely, I'm just ignoring that one behavior, right? I don't want to look at them, I don't want to talk to them. When they smarten up, so to speak, then I can give them attention. I will look at them, I will engage with them, so on and so forth. There have been a few times when I've had to teach my kids to ask for attention appropriately, right? Look at me, look what I did, look at my picture. That's perfectly okay. I will look at you and I will give you attention. I don't need you to, jump off the couch to get my attention. The other thing we can do is we can increase attention irrelevant to any of their behaviors, right? I can give praise, I can give cuddles, I can give hugs, I can do whatever it is throughout the day. They don't necessarily have to earn it. And then managing gaining access to tangibles. So you can modify your environment. If, for example, every time your kid comes in the kitchen, they want a cookie, move the cookies out of the way. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Manipulate your environment in your favor. We can also teach them, again, functional communication. They can ask nicely. If the item is unavailable, give them the opportunity to have something else. Or give them the choice between, what is available. No, you can't have screen time right now, but you can color or do a puzzle. That works. You can't have screen time right now, but maybe you can have screen time after dinner. You can't have your juice right now, but you can have chocolate milk instead. Whatever it is, offer an alternative, or you can give them a time when it is available. And when they do engage in a challenging behavior, don't give it to them. Because if you do, you're strengthening that behavior. If you as a parent, now I'm talking to you as a parent, not as a servant, if you as a parent know today's just not my day, and if Noah has a meltdown, I'm gonna give in, don't wait for the whole tantrum, right? Give in at the beginning. Because if you give in at the end, you're reinforcing a whole hour or whatever of behavior. We don't want them to learn, I just have to hold out for like 10 more minutes and mom's gonna give in. Like, mom's weak today, I'm just gonna wait 10 more minutes and I'm gonna just at the beginning. We don't wanna reinforce a big, long behavior. So some other antecedent strategies that we use. So antecedent strategies basically just means proactive. We wanna be proactive. Manipulate the environment to work in your favor. So I mentioned that for some of the access, out of sight, out of mind, right? If you have a kid who's constantly running out of the room, rearrange the room, stand in front of the door, right? That's gonna help you without having to actually implement any strategies. We had a client who was constantly going into the staff bathroom, so we just put a code lock on the door. Couldn't get in after that, right? I didn't have to go implement some crazy behavior, intervention. We just put a lock on the door, that's it. Use a schedule to allow for predictability. So Bassem mentioned that sometimes kids have a hard time with changes in routine. Give them that, that security of knowing what's coming next. What do I have to expect? Use visual cues. For those of you who don't know, I started homeschooling recently. If you come to my house, I have in our bathroom like a hand washing poster, how to wash your hands. We've got a calming strategies poster. We've got feelings. So I have cues up so that I can redirect my kids. Oh, how are you feeling right now? I don't have to be the one that's necessarily saying, oh, you look like you're sad. No, I want them to learn to depend on the visual cues and not on me. Offer choices when possible. So sometimes individuals engage in challenging behaviors because they want a sense of control. So you can offer forced choices. Do you want to wear the blue shirt or the red shirt? Do you want to drink out of the purple cup or the yellow cup? Right? I'm giving them control, but ultimately I'm still in control. Teach some calming strategies. So if you have individuals that are struggling with emotional regulation, teach them how to engage in calming strategies so that when they do reach that point, you can say, what do you need to do? You look like you're upset. What do you need to do to calm your body? And then prompt them when necessary. So I gave the example of the child throwing something on the floor. She didn't do it. I helped prompt her physically, or I can prompt her to a visual cue. I can do whatever it is just to help her be successful. So going back to the consequences, this is, again, what happens immediately after the behavior. And like I mentioned, this is going to determine if the behavior increases or decreases. It can strengthen a behavior, it can weaken a behavior, or it can maintain a behavior. It can have a neutral effect on it. I'm going to get a little more into that. I know, sorry, there's a lot of technicalities on this, but I just want you guys to understand how behaviors work. So just quickly recapping, Behavior is controlled and shaped by its consequences. It's strengthened or maintained by reinforcement, which I will go into because that's really, really important. It's weakened by withholding consequences that have maintained the behavior. So if you change how you react to a behavior, it might weaken that behavior. To effectively influence behavior, consequences must consistently and immediately follow the behavior that they are trying to control. So I cannot tell my kids to put on their shoes and an hour later give them an ice cream and be like, good job. They're gonna be like, for what? You know? And with that, they may have engaged in like 12 horrible behaviors that I'm now reinforcing, right? So it's gotta be very immediate and very specific. And then some consequences, especially those that are immediate, might have a different effect based on emotional state. So if, for example, you have a child that's really motivated by food, after lunch they might be less motivated. So I can't be like, if you do this, I'll give you a cookie. Well, they just had dessert, they don't care. So you gotta kind of look at their motivation. So now I'm going to talk about reinforcement. This is the part where it might get a little bit confusing as I go on, but this is given to someone after a desired behavior is displayed. So for those of you who are working, you get a paycheck at the end of the week or at the end of 2 weeks. If you didn't get that paycheck, you probably wouldn't want to work, right? And the other thing is, like I said, it's got to be pretty immediate. You know, like every other Thursday, I get my paycheck. But sometimes as parents, I'm like, okay, I'll give you your cookie. Yes, I know you ate all your food. I'll give it to you, I promise. But like, he doesn't know when he's gonna get his cookie. He gets like unmotivated, right? We have to make sure that we're consistent in what we're doing. So there's positive reinforcement and there's negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when you're adding a stimulus that strengthens a behavior. So I keep giving the examples of food. When I give my kids a candy, I'm strengthening a behavior, right? I'm presenting a stimulus that's now strengthening their behavior. Negative reinforcement is taking something away that will strengthen the behavior. So for example, I might say, if you go brush your teeth, you don't have to make your bed. So now he doesn't have to make his bed. Right? So I'm taking something away, but it's still reinforcing. It's strengthening the behavior of brushing his teeth. I hear the term negative reinforcement used so incorrectly very often, so I hope that makes sense. I'm going to talk about positive punishment and negative punishment. So punishment is going to decrease your behavior. Positive punishment is when you're given something that's going to decrease the behavior. So a good example of that is you're speeding, you get a fine, right? You're given something that's going to decrease your behavior. You're probably not going to speed again because you don't want to pay another ticket. Negative punishment is something taken away. So I'm going to take away your dessert if you misbehave, right? I'm taking something away that's like teenagers get phones taken away, they get, grounded. That's all negative punishment. You're taking something away and it's supposed to decrease the behavior. So this is just a quick chart to go over what I just talked about. So with positive reinforcement and positive punishment, you're adding a stimulus. Reinforcement will increase the behavior, and then punishment will decrease the behavior. And then with negative reinforcement and negative punishment, you're withdrawing a stimulus, you're taking something away. But again, with the negative reinforcement, you'll see the behavior go up. And then with negative punishment, you'll see the behavior decrease. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about like very, very, very few behavior management strategies, but social praise is huge, right? We want to give verbal reinforcement. Nothing feels better than someone saying, hey, Sandy, like you did a really good job cleaning the car today, right? I use that on my husband all the time. I thanked him for making dinner today, and he hasn't even made dinner yet, but he will, right, George? Thank you. So, and it has to be very specific too. I can't just be like, good job. Okay, for what, right? Like if you're trying to strengthen a specific behavior, like good job putting your socks on by yourself, good job doing this by yourself. You know, you did a really good job helping your sister. I really love that. And then engagement in a preferred activity. So if we're thinking about Sunday school, sometimes Sunday school is really long and boring. Like sometimes I'm in the car before my kids are on Sundays. I'm like, where are the kids? They're still in Sunday school. It's really, during COVID, it was really bad. Like their Zoom Sunday school was an hour. Imagine putting your kid in front of a TV for an hour. It's very long, right? It wasn't always engaging. It was hard to engage them over the screen. So keep them engaged in a preferred activity. Sometimes that means you have to modify your delivery, which is kind of what you have to figure out for yourself. The PREMAC principle is also a huge one. You can make visuals for this too, but first then. Okay, first you have to clean up, then we can go play your game. First you have to, get dressed, and then we can go to Tita and Giddu's house. Like whatever it is that is reinforcing to them. You can place a demand first, and then reinforce that behavior. And then the last thing is a token economy. So you want to provide positive reinforcement by giving tokens. So what you might do is, you earn 5 tokens and then you get your prize at the end. I didn't realize this until when I was preparing this presentation. We actually had a token economy when I was a kid in Sunday school. We had sticker books. George and Kiro, I don't even know if Kiro's in here. I don't know if you guys remember, there he is. The sticker books in Sunday school, where at the end of Sunday school you'd get a sticker if you were good, and then you'd go down to the office and you'd shop with however many stickers you had. You could pick your reward, right? Like you could get a cross, you can get a necklace, like whatever it was a token economy, right? We earned X amount of stickers, we got a reward. Is Noah in here? He's coming. So that takes me pretty much to the end of my presentation, but I do want Noah to come in here for a sec. Quick. Can you hold this? Tell everyone your name and how old you are.
I'm Noah, and I'm 4 years old.
Can you tell our friends, what is this?
This is a calming kit.
Can you tell them what's in the calming kit?
What's in the calming kit is stuff to calm our bodies.
Okay, can you show them some? Like, what's this?
That was St. Mary.
What do you do with St. Mary?
You hug her to make you feel better.
Yeah. Is there anything else in here you want to talk about?
These are all the stuff in the calming kit.
Okay, so when I started homeschooling, stay up here for a second, okay? When I started homeschooling, I wanted to make sure that we weren't having meltdowns all the time. So we talked about our feelings, and I made this calming kit, which unfortunately was super reinforcing, and all they wanted to do was play with it. But my hope was that, if they escalate, I can have this in the corner, and I could say, you know what, you look upset. Why don't you go find something in the calming kit that's going to calm your body? Take a break, right? So we had the St. Mary that they could hug if they were sad. We had, just some things to visually stimulate them. We had balls that they could squish. We have some fidget toys. There's a cross in here. There's a bunch of different things that I was hoping would help. Was it successful? Maybe kind of, right?
Yeah.
Tell them what's this.
This is a schedule.
Can you show them how it works?
You put what you're doing on here, and then when you're done using it, you put them in this pocket.
Can you show them how to put it in the all done? Right.
That's how you do it.
Yeah. So I created a visual schedule because I wanted them to know what we were doing in our day. And then as we went throughout the day, they were involved in it, right? They would take off the visual, they would put it in the pocket. Did Noah get really rigid with it? Yeah, absolutely. So I stopped using it for a bit because he was like, oh, we forgot to take all done off the schedule. Who's going to take it off the schedule? And I'm like, it's okay, Noah, we can do it when we get home. Can you show them this last tool that I have? Do you remember this? This is what we call a contingency map, so I can leave this behind. But what's this?
It's to learn about ears.
No,
And-
so this is the green road and the red road.
This is the red road.
So what happens,
This is the green road.
and which road do you want to take?
Green road.
Yeah, so when Noah listens, can I borrow this? When Noah listens, right, so this is Noah, he can take the green road and listen to mom and dad, and everybody is happy. Or he can take the red road and not listen, and what happens?
Everyone's sad.
Everyone is
Not gonna borrow this. We use the calming kit to calm our bodies, and we also use the schedule to put the things in here, the things in the pocket when we're all done using it.
Thank you, Noah. Yeah, so these are, like Bassem said, it's not necessarily kids with autism, right? These are things that I used in center when I worked with kids with autism. But now that I'm homeschooling, I'm using these with my own kids, right? And both of them are quote unquote neurotypical. Yeah, that's it. Thanks, buddy. That's all I have. So if you have any questions, please direct them to Bassem. Thank you.
She's using positive reinforcement with me too.
And also escape behavior. I'm not.
Yeah, escape behavior. So I hope this was helpful. I just want to point something out. When we talk about these things, it sounds so easy to do. Okay? They're not easy. They're very complex, and you need to understand the child or the adolescent, because one strategy might work okay, but another one might work much better. So you need to get to know the child, see what works, and also understand the child's strengths and weaknesses. So there is a phrase by a psychologist named Ross Greene. He talks about kids could do well if they can. Okay? It's not kids can do well if they want. So if you change from your mind that the kid is doing behaviors to personally upset you, and that there's maybe something that's getting in the way, then you guys will work together. You will collaborate rather than to bump heads. So kids can do well if they can, not kids can do well when they want. Okay? So sometimes a kid might be struggling because there is some form of weakness. So for example, some of the strategies that Sandy presented, some of them will work fantastic with a kid who is struggling with, for example, communication. So manipulating the environment is a perfect way to apply it with someone who might struggle with maybe understanding language very much. But someone who might be good in language, they might be more motivated by hearing praise or giving them some tangible sort of gifts to show the reward. So you need to know your child as well. Please do not be hard on yourself, but also do not take things personal. It takes a very long time. What we did today is we gave you a textbook of what it's supposed to look like. The application of that is obviously a lot messier, but with more practice, it does get easier. So I think we're open to some questions if you have any. I have a 10-second rule, and then I'm also going to escape.
I forgot to get Noah to show one other thing, but these are like little punch cards that I ordered. Usually I make a token board. Noah, do you want to come tell them about the punch card? Quick! God, he loves attention. He loves it. Okay, what are these punch cards?
They are for when we run out of the
When you
punch.
do good things?
When you do good things, you get punches, and if you get 10 in a row, you get to go do something fun.
Yeah, so this is like the token economy that I talked about. I use this as a group contingency in my house where they both work together to earn 10 hole punches, and when they get 10, we earn a reward. So it says here, after 10 punches, I will earn. And I like to fill that out beforehand. We talk about what do you want to work for today, because I want them to be motivated. Like I said, their motivational state might change based on, I don't know, day, time of day, whatever it was. So I like to get what they're motivated for in that moment, and this is how we have good days in my house.
Okay, I think the 10 seconds are up. Oh, Miriam has a question? Speak really loud. I don't know what's working.
So you mentioned that autism is more common in males than females. Is it something to do genetically with, like, is it something that's carried on the Y chromosome, or like what would be the reason that it's more common?
So the question is it something that is carried on the Y chromosome? And my answer is, I have no idea. And I think most people will tell you the same thing, because if we did know, we can maybe try to fix it somehow. I don't know. Maybe with artificial intelligence they will. I have no idea. Maybe George can tell us more about that. I don't know personally. It's not something that I'm familiar with. I don't do the genetic side or the biological side of things. But what we do know, it's more common in boys. Actually, ADHD is also more common in boys. You know, yeah. So have girls. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so some of these are more presented in boys. And actually, even with ADHD, some, like more commonly, girls will present more as inattentive, while boys with ADHD will present more as impulsive or hyperactive. It's not always, but that's typically how it's presented. Good question. I'm 0 for 1 so far. Any other questions? Maybe I'll ask you a question as a servant. Do you feel like any of this can be applied to your service? Yeah? I think for the really young ones, absolutely. Absolutely it can. For the older ones, it also can. You just have to be a little bit creative, because if you tell a 12-year-old, I'm going to give you like a token or I'm going to give you candy, they're not going to be motivated by that. So you have to make sure that it's also developmentally appropriate. Okay? But as I mentioned earlier, and as Sandy kind of showed it time and time again, don't worry too much about the diagnosis. Focus on the behavior and how to deal with that. Okay? Mark?
You mentioned earlier the importance of being able to sort of gather information, and how you can't just sort of base one-offs for, you know, any sort of diagnosis or characterization of certain inappropriate behaviors and so on. I guess my question is, do you have any recommendations where we don't necessarily spend a significant amount of time in one stretch with kids, where, for example, in Sunday school it may be an hour every Sunday, and then, for example, we obviously try to maximize our time with the kids, you know, via outreach, social gatherings, things like that. Do you have any sort of recommendations where we don't necessarily have a sort of wide array of data to gather from in terms of assessing their behaviors, whereas we can sort of pick up on things in those isolated events, for lack of a better word?
Great question. So what Mark is asking is, if you don't have all the information in the world and all the observations to know about the diagnosis, how can you maximize the time with them, right? So that's a really good question, and that goes back to kind of what Sandy was talking about, like focus on the behavior. So don't focus too much on, is it autism, is it ADHD, is it this or that, or the isolated incidents. It's see what the behavior is. Try from your experience to see, like there's that ABC chart, and I think maybe we can send some literature or some resources to you guys. But when you see a behavior, sometimes right away we want to react. You did this, don't do that, right? Like it's very common, especially like, I don't know, us as Egyptians, we like to just say, la 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 la, right? So like right away, ewa, right? But focus more on what happened before, what led to that, okay? So the antecedents. And also really focus on what the consequence after is. Because maybe that kid that is acting out, you giving them that attention is exactly what they want. So maybe there's something going on at home, or maybe they have ADHD, or maybe this and that, like we don't know. But what is the behavior? What was that behavior? And what was the consequence of that behavior? And also as important, the antecedent, what was that trigger that kind of led to the behavior, then that led to that consequence, and that's what you're acting upon. So focus on the behavior rather than focus on what kind of diagnosis it could be. And that will probably help to just clear your mind on just trying to pathologize everything. We tend to do that a lot, and as a psychologist telling you that tells you something, right? We shouldn't be doing too much diagnosis and just focusing more on behaviors. I feel like I'm 0 for 2 now with these questions. Any final thoughts, comments? Okay. Well, thanks for your attention, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Basim. You did a great job for the lesson that we got. I'm just doing like you told us. Thank you. I appreciate that. For you did good job for giving us this good lesson. Okay. I think for us as a servant, I think we need one more session just for how to deal with the behavior. Yeah. Not now, yeah. I think we need just to be more practical. So I will give you just 1 month, collect any cases, any questions, especially if we have some of those kids in our classes. I think it's not all classes, but we collect all these cases and how to deal with those people, and classified according to the age. Can we do that? Can we do that later on with you, Sandy? Just to focus on just how to deal with the behavior of those people, of those kids. Thank you, Habib. We have to celebrate with birthday, July's birthdays. July birthdays. Is your birthday in July? Best? No, yes. You? No? Okay. Nermeen Gadalla, Eva Solomon, Terry Wazan, Mina Ibrahim. Happy birthday, Mina. رانيا داود. استنى عشان ناخد صورة معاكم. استنى عشان ناخد صورة معاكم. رانيا سنة طيبة حبيبي. اتفضل عشان ناخد صورة. هايدي الراهب. هايدي الراهب. هابي بيرثدايز. نقعد بقى هنا كمان معاهم. رشا جرجس في السكاوت كامب. مينا ابراهيم. مينا ابراهيم الثاني. هو انتوا الاثنين في جولاي؟ أول مرة آخد بالي. أول ما آخد بالي. داليا غبريال مش موجودة. كرولوس شنودة. كرولوس جرجس. كرولوس شنودة. Yeah. Happy birthday, Carlos. We will miss you, حبيبي. كرولوس بقى له مدة ما جاش بس we're so happy to see him today. ناخد صورة. ممكن باسم وساندي ناخد صورة معاكم حبايبي؟ هم مش موجودين الباقيين بس. وأماندا وسارة وكريستين وميري توفيق مش موجودين. طب هناخد بس صورة معاهم وبعد كده في كيكة بره. في كيكة بره، ناخد كيكة معاهم. ممكن نقعد هنا كده، نقف هنا كده. باسم ما خلاص، ما عارفين عارفين احنا في الهوا سوا. باسم وساندي، ممكن ناخد صورة معاكم حبايبي؟ ويا Thank you. والسلام طيبين. Thank you حبايبي. Thank you حبيبي. Thank you يا راني. Thank you حبيبي. Thank you Basim. Thank you Sandy. We appreciate your help and assistance today. So let us pray first and then we'll go to take just a piece of cake. Botrus. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen.
We thank you, Lord, for this gathering. Thank you for allowing us to serve your children. Thank you for the lesson today, Lord, how to deal with the behavior of your children, Lord. Give us guidance, give us wisdom as we deal and interact with your children, Lord. We ask you, Lord, to bless every servant standing before you, every service for the glory of your holy name. And for your glory forever and ever. Amen.
Our Lord, make us worthy to pray. Thank you, our Father who art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In Christ Jesus our Lord. For thine the kingdom, the power, the glory forever and ever. May the love of God the Father, Pantocrator, and the grace of his only begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the gift of communion of the Holy Spirit, be with you all. Go in peace. The Lord be with you all. Amen. في كيكة. طبعا نطلع ناخد كيكة مع بعض.